February 19th, 1884. Around 11 in the morning, Mississippi. Across the farms and small towns of the American South, an ordinary Tuesday is underway. Trains move along the railroads, lessons continue in schoolhouses, and people work on farms and plantations. Nothing yet looks like the beginning of one of the most mysterious weather disasters in American history. But the atmosphere is already behaving strangely. Warm, humid air is pushing northward from the south. A deep area of low pressure is developing over the interior of the country, and winds at different altitudes are changing both speed and direction. Today, meteorologists would recognize this combination as dangerously unstable. Back then, almost no one on the ground could see what was coming. There was no weather radar, no satellite imagery, no radio broadcasting, and no modern warning system. There was only the telegraph, scattered observations, and a young science still struggling to understand violent storms. And before people in the first communities realized anything was wrong, a tornado was already forming over Mississippi. It was not the main disaster, it was only the beginning. At that time, even the word tornado did not mean what it means today. There was no organized warning network behind it. Sergeant John Park Finley of the United States Army Signal Corps was trying to understand why destructive vortices developed in some parts of storm systems but not in others. He collected reports, compared temperature, humidity, pressure, and wind direction, and was effectively building one of the earliest approaches to tornado forecasting. But on February 19th, that science still could not give thousands of people the one thing they needed most: several minutes to escape. Around 11:30, one of the first well-documented tornadoes crossed Lowndes County, Mississippi, and moved into Alabama. It destroyed tenant homes and plantation buildings. Roughly an hour later, another tornado was already cutting across Coosa County. Then another formed, and another. The disaster was not advancing like a single front that people could see approaching and wait out. It was being born again and again across an enormous region. People separated by tens or even hundreds of miles had no idea that their lives were already being connected by the same atmospheric system. After 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the situation changed dramatically. In Alabama, a tornado later judged to have been exceptionally violent tore through the areas of Oxmoor and Leeds. Its path stretched for dozens of miles. In Leeds, substantial homes were torn apart by the wind, and 13 people were killed. But almost immediately it became clear that this was not an isolated tragedy. Around 2:30, another powerful tornado began moving through Calhoun and Cherokee counties. It crossed a chain of rural communities, leaving destroyed homes, flattened forests, and families with nowhere to hide. 10 people were killed near Cross Plains. More died in Goshen. Modern retrospective analysis places this tornado among the most violent of the entire outbreak. At times, its width reached hundreds of yards, and its track continued for many miles. But the most terrifying part was not even the strength of a single tornado. While one vortex was disappearing, new ones were already forming farther east. In Goshen, the tornado struck a school. The wooden building was no shelter against winds of that magnitude. When the vortex reached the community, the school was destroyed. The teacher was killed, and all 25 students were injured. For the people living there were no warning sirens, no messages on a phone, no radar map showing the movement of a dangerous storm cell. Sometimes the only warning was the changing color of the sky, a sudden roar in the distance, or hail falling moments before impact. Then the air filled with boards, tree limbs, sections of roofs, dust, and soil. Contemporary reports described bales of cotton being carried extraordinary distances. Some houses vanished so completely that witnesses described places where almost no recognizable trace of a home remained. And still, these stories represented only a fraction of what was happening. While Alabama struggled to understand its losses, destructive storms were already moving into Georgia. Then the violence pushed farther east. Telegraph reports began arriving from different locations almost simultaneously, and the reality became impossible to ignore. The South was not dealing with one tornado. It was facing an entire succession of them. By evening, the scale of the disaster could no longer be quickly calculated. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky. Reports of destruction were arriving from more and more places. In some communities, roofs had been ripped away and barns destroyed. In others, entire groups of homes were gone, Roads were blocked by fallen trees, telegraph lines were damaged, and across the rural south, enormous distances separated isolated settlements from the outside world. News from some locations could take hours or even days to arrive, and this is where the story becomes even more disturbing. We still do not know exactly how many tornadoes formed that day. Later reconstructions indicate at least several dozen, while historical estimates approach 60. But some tornadoes may have crossed sparsely populated countryside and never entered the written record at all. The same problem affected the death toll. Early newspapers printed enormous and often contradictory figures. Some victims may have been counted more than once. Others may never have appeared in official records. The catastrophe was becoming more than enormous. It was becoming almost impossible to measure. Late that evening, one of the deadliest tornadoes of the outbreak moved through the Rockingham area of North Carolina. Before it arrived, witnesses reported large hail and almost continuous flashes of lightning. Then the tornado intensified. On the southeastern edge of the town, it snapped large trees close to the ground and destroyed homes. Farther along its path stood a small community known as Philadelphia. Most of its fragile wooden houses were destroyed. At least 15 people were killed in that community alone, while the known death toll along the tornado's full path reached 23. In North Carolina, it remains one of the deadliest tornadoes in the state's historical record. But even there, help could not arrive the way it would today. Through the darkness, survivors searched for relatives by the light of lanterns and oil lamps. They pulled apart wreckage with their hands and carried the injured into whatever buildings were still standing. Doctors and neighbors worked with whatever supplies they could find. In some places, miles of muddy roads and broken communication lines stood between devastated communities and the first outside assistance. The next morning, the American South awoke surrounded by wreckage. But even then, no one could give a final count of what had been lost. Historical reports described thousands of destroyed structures, thousands of injured people, and enormous numbers left without homes. John Finley later gave an estimate of roughly 800 dead and around 15,000 homeless. Modern researchers treat that number with caution. Contemporary reconstructions can reliably confirm roughly 180 deaths, while acknowledging that the true toll may have been higher. Much of the South was rural, and many victims were poor tenant farmers and black agricultural workers whose deaths in the 19th century were often recorded incompletely or not recorded at all. That uncertainty gave the event a name that has survived longer than many of the communities it devastated: the Enigma Tornado Outbreak. We know that something extraordinary happened. We know the paths of many of the tornadoes. We know the names of communities that were destroyed. But more than a century later, there are still empty spaces between the surviving facts. And perhaps those empty spaces are what make February 19th, 1884, so unsettling. This was a catastrophe in a world that had almost no ability to see such a threat in advance. There were no radar maps, instant alerts, networks of storm spotters, or shelters designed to modern standards. People often learned that a tornado was coming only when it was already in front of them. Finley's work after outbreaks like this helped establish some of the earliest rules for tornado prediction. Yet official weather services would later restrict the use of the very word tornado in forecasts, fearing that it might cause panic. The contradiction is striking. One of the most devastating tornado outbreaks in American history demonstrated just how desperately people needed warnings, while the system itself would remain reluctant for decades to speak openly about the threat. Today, we can still debate whether there were 50 tornadoes, 60 or even more, and exactly how many people lost their lives. But one fact is beyond dispute. In the space of only a few hours, an ordinary winter day became a corridor of destruction stretching from Mississippi toward the Carolinas, leaving behind a disaster whose true scale we are still trying to reconstruct.